Hello and welcome to Atop the Fourth Wall, where bad comics burn. Marvel That Meets the Eye concludes with the follow-ups to Marvel's Transformers series over the years. Some were disappointed that I wouldn't be covering Transformers 84 as part of this retrospective. Well, that's for two reasons. One, as you can see, this retrospective has gotten longer than I would have preferred. And two, when I decided to do this retrospective, I didn't know it existed. I'm normally just a Big 2 follower and just a casual Transformers fan, so I didn't know that for the 35th anniversary of the comic, IDW published a one-shot prequel to the Marvel series, then following it up with another 4-issue prequel under the same moniker, with the subtitle Secrets and Lies. The original one-shot went into details about both the original mission of the arc, as well as explaining events from the Man of Iron two-parter originally published in the UK books and then reprinted in the US. Thing is, I'm not particularly fond of that two-parter or the stuff they introduced there about another Autobot expedition in the 11th century that crashed in England. Side note, what the hell is it about Earth that makes most Transformers in this continuity crash on it instead of land safely? The number 0 one-shot is frustrating for me for one big reason. It says that Optimus Prime deliberately lured Megatron out as a suicide action, deliberately get their ship to crash in the hopes of destroying him, seeing him as the real threat to Cybertron's future. Sorry, but I just have to call bullcrap on that. Even forgetting Optimus Prime being as noble a leader in general, I especially do not see the Optimus Prime of the Marvel continuity being willing to sacrifice all the other Autobots on the Ark just to take down Megatron. Remember, this is the dude who thought he deserved to die for accidentally killing NPCs in a video game. Sure, maybe you could argue character development. He changed and wasn't willing to do that sort of thing in the future. Just the level of deception and immorality for such an act seems antithetical to who Optimus Prime is as a character. Just no. That being said, the miniseries is mostly decent, expanding on ideas like the strap an engine to Cybertron to make it fly around the universe thing, or introducing Ultra Magnus into the continuity despite not being a character in the Marvel book. Other stuff like the origin of the Dinobots versus Shockwave fight and trying to fill in plot holes from that just adds some new ones to me when it suggests that Grimlock went back to the Ark and then had to fight the Ark's computer, which then activated antimatter in Megatron or something. It's just weird and unnecessary in my opinion. But overall, I'd say it's pretty good and worth a read if you're interested in this continuity. Speaking of that continuity, that brings us back to what we're really here to talk about. In 1991, when the Marvel Transformers series ended, Simon Furman wrote in the letters page that the Transformers franchise was pretty much dead and gone. And in his defense, he wasn't entirely wrong. No American show, no comic, the American toy line was pretty much canceled after Action Masters, and Beast Wars was still a long way off from being a thing. However, the toys were still being released in other parts of the world, and the success of European sales convinced Hasbro to try the franchise again with Generation 2 in 1993. The toys were a combination of redecos of old stuff, new versions of old stuff, and eventually stuff that would become standards of the line, in particular ball joints for limbs. This right here is Strafe, a Generation 2 Cyberjet. It's actually the Transformers toy I've owned the longest. Hell, as a kid, I didn't even know its name. I have no idea where it came from, I've just always had it, and later when I started collecting Transformers as a teen, was disappointed that the toys didn't have as much posability as Strafe. Generation 2's attempt at a TV show wasn't. It was just the original cartoon, but now with really stupid CGI transitions and frames, referred to as the Cybernet Space Cube, that ended up screwing with the editing of the show. Just imagine that whenever I switch from live action to the comic panels or whatever, I suddenly have to shrink it. Where have I been? But while there wasn't a new TV show, there was a new comic. They actually did produce a UK comic like the original Marvel series, but it only lasted 5 issues due to low sales. Produced by Fleetway since Marvel UK had collapsed by that point. In the US though, they once again turned to Marvel to produce the Generation 2 comic. Because this was the 90s, the age of the speculator boom, and the fact that the original book had been cancelled due to low sales, they were only contracted for a 12-issue maxi series, with the option for more if it was successful enough. It wasn't. Let's dig into Transformers Generation 2 and see how that turned out. Welcome to Atop the Fourth Wall. To build some hype for Generation 2, Marvel decided to have some lead up to the book in the pages of G.I. Joe, specifically issues 138 to 142. It's a few years after the events of the original comic, and who should show up at a Cobra base but Megatron, having survived the crash of the Ark at the end of the book. He apparently spent a few years repairing the Ark and hiding it in the Canadian Arctic, but apparently spent no time on his own maintenance. And I guess Spike never bothered to tell anyone about the crashed Ark, nor did any Canadian authorities detect it crashing. It's kinda hilarious that my clip from MST3K last week shows more sense than this book.
Canada calls to ask, what are you guys doing up there?
Anyway, Megatron makes a deal with Cobra, rebuild his body and give him a scientist, Dr. Biggles Jones, and he'll give them the advanced Cybertronian technology of the Ark. And none of them asked, hey, didn't we already have a deal with you guys a few years ago? What even happened to you? I heard you guys made a vacation resort that was also an island nation. We made our own island nation once too, you know. They rebuild him in his Generation 2 body, now a tank instead of a gun because of concerns about a kid's toy looking like a realistic weapon, and he eventually just screws over Cobra by taking off with Biggles Jones in the Ark, which really means that this issue should have been called Biggles and the Menace from Space. So yeah, we're directly continuing on from the first Marvel series. Which is funny because according to Simon Furman in the letters page, this book is explicitly not supposed to be a continuation. A fresh start was needed, and that's how we approached the book. Everything I thought I knew about Transformers went out the window. Yeah, it's as much of a fresh start as Steven Universe Future was from Steven Universe. You could have labeled this number 81 and I would have believed it. The only thing they really leave unexplained is that Grimlock can transform again despite losing that ability from the Action Master process. But we can imagine that with the resources of Cybertron now in the hands of the Autobots, they can figure out how to repair that. Also, unlike the original, you don't have to expect individual issues devoted to new toys that Hasbro wants in. Sure, Generation 2 toys are promoted, as seen with Megatron, but it's not going to suddenly interrupt the action to see like Strafe joining a baseball team or something. He'd be really good at it too. The built-in missiles work as natural baseball bats. There's a 0th issue to Generation 2, reprinted at the end of the second issue for some reason, but it's not really relevant to the overall story, so let's move on to the first proper issue. I actually reviewed the first issue of Generation 2 back in 2012, and at the time, quite a few people were upset that I was bashing it. And almost a decade later, I stand by everything I said. I'm not gonna mince words here. Generation 2 sucks. There are good ideas, and it does improve as the series goes on, but the execution of those ideas is just terrible, and the pacing is a slog to get to the better parts. It's too slow, it's drawn like garbage, and I only care about what's happening because it's carrying on from the previous series. The cover, both the front and its gimmicky gatefold cover, plus a second gimmick with chrome on it, pretty much spell out most of the artistic problems right away. Transformers is dragged kicking and screaming into the 90s, with a too edgy for you line up top saying, "This is not your father's Autobot." Lots of focus on violence, pouches. Later on, they even try to make Optimus Prime more like a 90s superhero by adding the equivalent of neck muscles to him. Everyone's shooting huge, impractical guns and scowling or gritting their teeth, and there's barely any backgrounds, and it's all too busy and noisy to look at. Dude! That's what makes it so awesome! Robots and disc guns! But I suppose we should actually talk about the story of this stuff at some point. In issue 1, Optimus has been getting premonitions of impending doom, some ancient force slaughtering the Transformers. Despite the pacing of the book, we're actually very quickly introduced to the recurring menace of the series, a Decepticon faction led by the character G-Axis. G-Axis is interesting for two reasons. One, he's a character invented for the comics without an accompanying toy, and two, his name is a joke. Furman knew that Marvel was placing unrealistic expectations on the book's sales if it was going to stay beyond 12 issues, so with tongue planted firmly in cheek, he named the enemy G-Axis. Stay tuned for a future storyline of this show where I battle the villain, YouTube Del-Eat Machinel. G-Axis explains to Prime that he and his Decepticon forces vacated Cybertron shortly after the Ark first crashed on Earth. They don't even see themselves as Decepticons anymore, but just Cybertronians, dedicated to creating a vast interstellar empire. They burn worlds along the way, draining all the resources and converting them into mini Cybertrons as they go. G-Axis finds the Autobot vs. Decepticon war to be childish, long since resolved, no it wasn't, and they should be focusing their efforts on conquering more worlds and annihilating the puny fleshling infestations on them. Prime is somehow devastated by this little speech, despite it not really making any difference. The Cybertronian Empire is the offshoot, but he's all, "We're a joke and useless, we fought for nothing," as if he was forgetting and disregarding, 80 issues of story. Grimlock is actually the one who shows signs of character growth, especially in light of everything he went through, and pointing out the value of all life, a lesson that Optimus himself had tried to teach him when he died fighting Unicron. Which would be really inspiring if the artwork wasn't so utterly depressing, dreary, and washed out. We'll talk some more about G-Axis and his forces later. After the Autobots escape from him, this leads us into issue 2, which follows directly on from the G.I. Joe stuff. Spike, of all people, actually showed up near the end of the last G.I. Joe issue tie-in, but he just came out of nowhere, being a tiny part of a panel before he snuck on board the Ark. And I wouldn't have known it was Spike if he didn't call himself that in a thought cloud. In fact, the way he wasn't focused on gave the distinct impression that he showed up earlier at some point, and I had just missed it. But nope, he's just there randomly, having sensed Autobots nearby or whatever. Point is, he snuck back on board the Ark as Megatron flies it off and he heads to Fortress Maximus's body. It's not exactly in great shape, probably still damaged from the fight with Galvatron. Transformers have limited automatic repair systems, but they can only do so much. Fortunately, with the help of another Autobot who got on board, they're able to blow the Ark up and presumably kill off Megatron. However, it's at the cost of Fortress Maximus's life. Dr. Biggles-Jones and the other Autobot skydive, escaping. Farewell, Spike and Fort Max. You were unceremoniously killed off in a mediocre story that said we didn't need to know continuity in order to understand why you were significant. Why was this necessary? It gets better. Hotspot, who was in pursuit of Cobra for some discarded junk that Megatron gave them, also sacrificed himself so that Cobra couldn't get any Transformer tech. Now, why was that significant, since he wasn't exactly a major character? Well, because apparently Optimus made it clear that Cobra could not be allowed to get any Transformers tech, dead or alive. Basically making it clear, if you are captured, blow yourself up. What the hell? Issue 3 might have been an interesting idea, but once again, it's the execution that ruins it. First, by setting it in media res, with the Autobot Huffer giving exposition about what happened. Was that? It was Hound giving that info? No. Well, as evidenced by when I talked about the issue with Spider-Man, I am apparently incapable of distinguishing between Hound and Huffer. Won't make that mistake again. So anyway, Cliffjumper here talks about how G-Axis pursued them after escaping his ship. Entering a nebula, both forces seem to be overwhelmed by feelings of aggression, even Optimus affected by it. Ironhide here only escaped it after getting hit in the head with a stray beam, and eventually Optimus and G-Axis realize that some alien force on the planet is compelling them to fight and make a truce between them to end the fighting. They say it's these weird shadow spider things, but personally I blame this thing. Again, Star Trek and Transformers are in the same universe, so it adds up. At the end, G-Axis thinks to himself that if the Autobots are right about all life being worthy of consideration, that would make him a butchering tyrant, which he can't accept, before ordering them to annihilate the planet's surface where these creatures call home. G-Axis, a gentle soul, not unlike the Fixer from Holy Terror. Like I said, there's a germ of a good story idea here, but the dialogue isn't very interesting. It seems to get resolved very quickly. Starting in media res for this just comes across as more confusing than anything else, not helped by a big exposition dump about what's happening by Blue Streak here. Also, for some reason, the issues began being split into 2 stories, even if they weren't really complete short stories, just a subplot or the like. So the main story was Primal Fear, but then the last 6 pages are Old Evils, which shows us what Bludgeon's Decepticons have been up to since the end of the first series. Building a gigantic war world ship, as it's called, and readying a new army of Decepticons. However, Bludgeon needs the creation matrix to give them life, so he plans to lure out Optimus Prime Prime by attacking Earth. Does Optimus even still have the creation matrix? His corpse wasn't exactly holding it anymore after he destroyed Unicron, and the last Autobot built a new body around Haikyuu. Did he get a new one from that? Also, apologies for the quality of the scans of some of these comics, especially issue 3. I have 2 sets of scans of the Generation 2 comic. One is overall decent and the other not. But some issues are pretty much the same low quality. Anyway, in issue 4, Optimus's premonitions reveal more of the apocalyptic threat. Something that seems to swarm over his arm and melt it away like acid. Grimlock decides to act on his own initiative and has a team of Autobots do hit-and-run strikes on G-Axis' forces, but eventually are captured when they try to destroy his flagship. Prime rescues them and is actually impressed enough with his abilities to put him in command while he goes off on a mission, despite Grimlock's misgivings about mistakes he made during this. Issue 4 is okay, just rushed a bit, and I question Prime once again putting Grimlock in a leadership position. While he fared better his second time around at the end of the book, he still was doing stuff without Prime's authorization because he thought Prime wasn't making the right call. Anyway, can't wait to see Prowl complaining about every single thing he does again. The second story is the start of the multi-part Tales of Earth, wherein Bludgeon attacks Earth openly, killing countless people to try to attract Prime to it. However, he's stopped by Megatron and Starscream. You have something of mine, namely the leadership of the Decepticons. I want it back over your dead body. Now, Bludgeon, Whoops! Bludgeon, quickly! Megatron has fallen! Make me the new leader! God, I love this stupid 90s scowling Starscream. Anyway, issue 5 brings us back to Cybertron. Prime undergoes a procedure with these sacred robed guys that will allow him to access the Matrix and see if he can make sense of his visions. Optimus sees the early days of Transformer life on Cybertron. Most importantly, he sees that once upon a time, Transformers were able to reproduce, well, for lack of a better term, asexually, a liquid form expelling out of another transformer like a kind of mitosis and forming a new robot. The process is called budding, and this is where we get the in-story justification of the series title, describing G-Axis and his forces as the next generation of Transformers. It's a little vague on details in this issue, but the idea seems to be that every Transformer has a part of Primus inside them, but the budding distills that amount of Primus a little bit more. There's a maximum amount of Transformers that can be around before those who come about are corrupted and lack Primus's own light and morality. Hence, G-Axis' generation are bad. However, what Prime doesn't see, because he ends the vision before seeing it in full, is that it got even worse. More and more budding occurred until there's so little of Primus that the energy that is formed within these Transformers is utterly corrupt, forming into new life and separating itself from Transformers to leave Cybertron and Moss. Like I said, I think Generation 2 has some good ideas, and this is one of them not properly explored. This whole new generation of Transformers thing. Recall that in the original Marvel series, Primus stated that the war between Autobots and Decepticons had stagnated their development. A group of Cybertronians who left millions of years ago and were allowed to continue to evolve away from the war, only for that evolution to actually be a bad thing? There's potential there, either because of their separation from Cybertron and Primus himself, or just because Primus didn't realize that the path he wanted them on, to ultimately fight Unicron, was actually rife with danger of becoming the very darkness he fought. Unfortunately, it instead takes the attitude, according to Optimus, that Primus actively resisted this form of procreation, erasing its existence from their collective memory. There's also an iffy eugenics argument to be made with this about population control, nature versus nurture, admittedly a little more complicated because these are robots, but still, Grimlock has changed since his original tyrannical days, seeing one form of people as less because of the way they were born, etc. There are ideas here that certainly warrant some cool exploration, but the way they're presented is overly simplistic and questionable, especially when we've already got a group of pretty much evil robots that aren't even part of this distillation thing. Yeah, G-Axis and the Cybertronian Empire are positioned to be a different type of enemy than normal Decepticons, but in practice, they're really no different than Megatron or Thunderwing or any of the other Empire-building Decepticons. Just they say, well, we're special because we don't call you Autobots. Speaking of, Bludgeon is impressed by Megatron and Starscream. You should have stayed dead. We suffer from a disquieting knack, Megatron and I, of refusing to do just that. Ratchet, though, screw him, he's still dead. Yeah, we never get an explanation how these two survived the destruction of the Ark, especially Starscream, who I guess Megatron repaired again in the meantime on the side while fixing the Ark. Megatron destroys Bludgeon, who puts up a good fight. Despite Megatron ripping off his Pretender shell head, he still keeps on blasting, and once more becomes leader. In issue 6, as Megatron tours Warworld and decides to stick with Bludgeon's plan to lure out Prime, Soundwave, still purple even in Gen 2, asks him why the hell he brought back Starscream.
His record of treachery and deceit is legend. He has betrayed you many times.
Actually, technically in the Marvel continuity, he never really did. He got blown up by a Mega Supreme, revived and worked for Ratbat, was resurrected by Megatron, who then seemingly died. He betrayed Scorponok and then died again on the Ark. Sure, he tried to undermine Megatron, but technically he's never betrayed him.
You are, of course, quite right, Soundwave. Starscream is a backstabbing miscreant who will attempt to seize power at the first opportunity. However, he has served me well thus far, providing much-needed mobility after the Ark was destroyed and bolstering our surface troops.
Look, Megatron, just admit you got a crush on the doofus. It's the only explanation at this point why you keep bringing him back. Prime heads to Earth alone since he wants to join forces with Megatron to fight G-Axis, but Megs isn't listening, just ripping open Prime's chest and stealing the Matrix before Grimlock arrives with backup. On an alien world, though, a black cloud of creatures arrives and kills off some nomadic aliens before flying off, identified as the Swarm, the creatures that the Cybertronians evolved into after several generations of budding. In issue 7, a force of Decepticon scouts that Megatron sent out into space are destroyed by G-Axis, including poor Skullgrin. Dude finally apologized and worked to make amends and stop being racist and had a new career in TV going before this happened. Tragic, really. And Megatron decides to confront the second-generation Transformers himself, rallying his troops to say that they're just upstarts using the Decepticon banner. Death! Rip! Tear! Wait, was Doomguy a Transformer? Death to the Pretenders! Ooh, awkward thing to say when this crowd shot features a bunch of pretenders. This plan does not go well. G-Axis' fleet is enormous and quickly overwhelms the war world, killing a bunch of them. Megatron tries to fight G-Axis himself, and he just rants at Megs about how he's an evolutionary throwback and wants them to be forgotten. Megatron gets blasted and crashes on a planet, a bunch of Decepticons soon finding him. He's alive, but only just barely, brought back to the injured Optimus Prime, half destroyed and finally ready to talk, leading into issue 8. G-Axis makes a speech saying he's sick of the Autobots continually interfering, yeah, most of that happened off-panel it would seem, and that they're going on a crusade to exterminate all non-Transformer life, along with the Autobots themselves. Megatron and Prime agree to a temporary alliance, defeating one of G-Axis' attacks on some space amoebas. Unfortunately, that's when Starscream goes missing to go do a treason. This is my surprised face. In issue 9, as the Swarm begins descending on worlds where G-Axis' forces are attacking aliens and consuming them, Starscream meets up with G-Axis to join forces, offering Optimus and Megatron. An examination of an attack by the Swarm on another planet— wait, is that Tom Servo? Crotty Robot?
Horrid lumps of discharge destroy beautiful innocent robots with impunity, laughing all the way.
The attack reveals to our heroes the existence of the Swarm, but that discussion gets tabled when they're attacked by the Cybertronian Empire. Issue 10 reveals that, of course, Starscream is responsible for revealing their whereabouts and giving G-Axis the tactical information about the war world and their defenses. And I guess nobody thought, maybe we should adjust those in case the well-known traitor who just disappeared decided to go off and be a traitor. The Autobots and Decepticons are able to start fighting back despite surprise, superior firepower, and superior numbers, much to G-Axis' shock. And it kind of makes sense. He chalks it up to guile and bloody-mindedness, but the thing is, the Cybertronian Empire is used to just using sheer numbers to overcome enemies, very few of whom are probably capable of mounting an adequate defense. The Autobots and Decepticons, by contrast, are made up of forces who have been constantly at war for 4 million years. Sure, Prime and Megatron themselves were out of action for most of that, but plenty of their troops weren't, and even then their tactics have evolved because of the constant struggle. They know how to turn the tide against bad odds because they've had to do so again and again. Still, when all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, so Geaxis is just like,
Send everything! Every single last one of our forces to destroy them and end this! Why? That's what they all asked me. Why him? Why Starscream? Why, of all Decepticons, did I decide to revitalize the one whose record of deceit and betrayal is legend? Because I'm an idiot, that's why.
Hey, you said it, not us. But I'll say it now anyway, you're an idiot, Megatron. Still, the odds are getting too much for our heroes, and Optimus— Oh my god, Optimus, what's wrong with your neck? Anyway, Optimus realizes that if Warworld falls into enemy hands, then they could get hold of the Matrix. Wait, they've been allies for a while now. Why didn't he put the Matrix back inside himself? But yeah, they're too late. Starscream being Starscream, he goes for the Matrix. Meanwhile, the Swarm takes some of Geaxis' ships and, learning of the signal recalling everyone to Earth, decides to go there too. Optimus and Megatron arrive at the Warworld, but with the power of the Matrix, Starscream has merged with it.
Through the Matrix, I have become one with the Warworld, making it an extension of my own consciousness. I have become, in essence, a living weapon!
Don't you transform into a jet? That's a weapon too.
Well, yes, but—
And Decepticons are mighty warriors who have built-in weapon systems. Hell, I used to literally be a gun.
You're missing the point!
I think the point is that saying you're a living weapon is not as impressive as being, say, cosmically powered.
In issue 11, Starscream begins to torture the two leaders for the indignities he suffered, while Geaxis, pissed that Warworld is now attacking all his forces, decides to leave and go deal with the problem himself. His subordinate, Rook, realizes that Geaxis has been losing his calm demeanor that he was supposed to have had throughout this book, getting more and more aggressive as they're continually thwarted, and decides to contact the Liege Maximo. Supposedly this is a typo and it's supposed to be Liege Maximo, but it's shocking how many times they keep doing it, even on the same page as the correct spelling. Prime and Megatron— well, I was gonna say get away from Starscream, but how one does that when they're inside of him, I couldn't really tell ya. Point is, Megatron distracts Starscream while Prime tries to contact Geaxis in the hopes of getting him to join forces with them against the Swarm. Instead, Geaxis has his forces target and annihilate San Francisco.
Yes, I could have sent this awesome destructive power on the thing that's destroying my ships, but instead I'm just going to target a human city. I'm a smart villain.
However, Warworld suddenly turns its attentions on Geaxis' ship. Starscream himself doesn't even get why he's doing it.
The fate of the fleshlings means nothing to me! Nothing! And yet it's as if I have to protect them!
But I must save the children.
Optimus realizes that, unlike the last time the Matrix was used for evil, in this case, it's the Matrix corrupting Starscream.
Somehow the creation Matrix is rewriting him, gradually turning evil into good.
Someone set this thing to evil.
Unfortunately, he can't really celebrate that for too long, because the Swarm has arrived, leading into the final issue of Generation 2. Geaxis orders his forces to attack the Swarm, but it just gets its attention, leading it to slaughter his forces. Starscream reluctantly surrenders the Matrix to Optimus so he can stop being consumed with helping people. While Megatron forces Starscream to help him prepare to combat the Swarm, Optimus travels to Geaxis' ship, sensing that the Swarm has an intelligence that they might be able to communicate with.
Perhaps through him, one of the original second-generation Transformers, I can contact the Swarm.
Oh yeah, just like how if you have a copy of Windows 3.1, it'll be able to more effectively communicate with Windows 10. Geaxis is not in the mood to talk, though, blaming everything falling apart on Optimus. He just beats the crap out of him, ranting and rambling how this is all his fault until the Swarm breaks through the ship. However, the Swarm does indeed respond to Geaxis challenging it, mimicking his appearance before it rips him apart. Farewell, Geaxis. I'd say you were an interesting villain, but in practice you were really just guy who gets increasingly more pissed off as the series went on.